transforming Guyana. In each episode, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis will tackle a different area of interest for transforming Guyana.
Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 9 of the Guyana Business Journal and Caribbean Policy Consortium webinar series, Transforming Guyana. I am Terrence Blackman, Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Anthony Bryan from the Caribbean Policy Consortium and the University of the West Indies. Our regular co-host, Dr. David Lewis, is traveling and so not available for today's program. Let me first take a moment just to welcome you all. This has been to say first a happy Valentine and to welcome you all to this program on fiscal policy in the era of oil and gas for Guyana. This has been, quite surprisingly, with such a boring title, it has been the second most subscribed program for this season. So I hope that the conversation will meet your expectations. But just as a reminder, you know, it's as we've fielded questions about the program, I want to take a moment just to reiterate sort of the GBJ's vision. We want to, by way of this program, provide transformative and hopefully pragmatic thought leadership that will empower and enrich Guyana and its people to achieve broadly, as we see it, three objectives. We want to enhance Guyana's vibrant and inclusive, and make more inclusive Guyana's democracy. We want to improve economic, social, and security conditions, creating a more equitable, diverse opportunities for all Guyanese, and to ensure a harmonious, resilient, flourishing Guyana where every citizen benefits from its economic growth, regardless of background or beliefs. And to this end, this series, Transforming Guyana, aims to bridge the gap between experts and prominent voices from Guyana, the Caribbean, the diaspora, and around the world to discuss the far-reaching impacts of Guyana's oil and gas development. We will, from time to time, challenge the conventional wisdom, but we always hope to offer balanced and insightful look at the opportunities and the potential pitfalls ahead for Guyana, and to explore innovative and we hope effective strategies to maximize the oil revenue's positive impacts on Guyana's people in future while mitigating the risks that other countries face. And today, and I suspect this is the reason for the huge response to this one, we're pleased to welcome Colin Constantine, Assistant Professor and Fellow of Economics at Girton College, Cambridge. And he brings to us a wealth of knowledge in economic theory and its applications. Thomas Singh, Senior Lecturer at the University of Guyana and the Director of the Green Institute at the University of Guyana. Samuel Braithwaite, Lecturer in Economics at the University of West Indies, Mona. And we also hope to offer the experience of the former Director of Economics at the Caribbean Development Bank, Justin Ram, to give us a kind of broader Caribbean economic context. And finally, Bright Simmons, the Honorary Vice President of the Imani Center for Policy and Education. We hope that he will enrich this conversation with a perspective from Ghana and his expertise in in policy and education. Let me just say one last thought before I bring Professor Brian in for a welcome from the Caribbean Policy Consortium. In this era of significant economic transformations, particularly in the burgeoning oil and gas sector, Guyana stands at a really crucial juncture. And the dynamics of fiscal policy within this evolving landscape present profound challenges and remarkable opportunities. And I think if we draw from global and local instances, we see that questions of fairness and equity have really taken center stage in the economic discourse, be it job allocations, compensation practices, consumer pricing. As I saw in some notes, the question of the teacher strike in Guyana, the ongoing budget debate, how much do we spend on infrastructure relative to how much do we spend on wages? How does this drive inflation? And so what we hope is that our discussion will broadly elucidate this intricate balance that Guyana has to navigate, and more broadly to extend some of these discussions of fiscal policy into the realm of how equitable and fair practices can underpin Guyana's future-looking fiscal strategies. And I suppose with that, I want to ask Professor Anthony Bryan to say a word of welcome on behalf of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. Professor Bryan.
Thank you very much. Terence, thank you. And colleagues, thank you very much for attending, and to say nothing of the number of people who are watching this broadcast. Welcome on behalf of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. We are a very active group. You could always check us out on cpccaribbean.org. We've partnered with the Guyana Business Journal now. I think this is probably about the sixth event. And Terence has laid it out very clearly that Guyana is at a crossroads at this point. This is probably one of the most important of the events that we will do. This is really the crux of how Guyana goes ahead. As you know, accelerated fiscal expenditure will increase domestic inflationary practices, potentially, as it will, creating a great deal of stress within the Guyanese environment and certainly internationally. So I look forward to a very active discussion, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you, Professor Bryan. So today we are very fortunate to lead this off. When I envisaged how we might structure this program, I thought what we needed was someone to give us a broad technical sense of some of the challenges that go to the broad issue of fiscal policy, and then to touch on the implications for those policies in Guyana. And that would be followed by someone from the economic perspective who was locally attuned to Guyana, who sort of lived in Guyana, and then sort of to widen out the lens and to think about it within the context of the region, and then more broadly to widen out the lens and to think about it within the context of the world. And today we're very fortunate to be joined by Professor Colin Constantine, who, given my reading, is one of the foremost sort of Guyanese economic thinkers on these matters. He brings to us a wealth of understanding, and I don't want to take up much of the time. Colin, welcome, and you can go ahead and share your slides and help us to better understand these ideas of fiscal policy.
All right, thank you, Terence. Just give me a moment. Great. Could you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yep, it's there. Yeah.
Brilliant. All right. Terence, thank you very much for the kind invitation. And indeed, you did ask for some clarity on fiscal policy in Guyana's new economic circumstance, and I hope to make a small contribution in trying to present a better understanding of some of these issues. All right. So I think I have 50 minutes thereabouts. So I
Yeah.
just have 14 slides, but there is a detailed appendix to pick up the more details and some of the things I say here. All right. What I mean by old wine with this slide is that, look, monetization of fiscal deficits is a classic problem for economies across the world, particularly developing economies. We monetize because, well, we lack fiscal institutions in terms of tax collection, or we lack earning potential in terms of earning foreign exchange. The new bottle here, well, the latest case that is prominent, of course, is Ghana. And I just want to briefly read some of the headlines from the World Economic Forum in
Can you
2019.
move the slide to your second? Can you go to your second slide? We're just seeing
Sure. What are you saying? Sorry?
we're just seeing the fiscal policy in Guyana's economic landscape.
I have moved it, you know. Should I stop sharing and try again, Terrence?
Yes.
All right.
Maybe if you want to upload the slides themselves.
You mean to the chat?
Yes.
Let me
Just try to do it once more, because we only saw the.
I'll share my entire screen. That's fine. Could you see this now?
Yes, this is better.
Old wine, new bottle?
Yes, we see old wine, new bottle. Yes.
Brilliant. As I said moments ago, the old wine is the classic problem of monetized deficits. I'll explain what that means in a few minutes. And the new bottle is just the latest case, that is Ghana. Of course, Ghana was touted as the fastest growing economy in 2019. If you fast forward a few short years, it promised, the central bank in Ghana promised to stop monetizing the deficits. That was an agreement it reached with the IMF in exchange for $3 billion bailout. And when we teach economics in terms of debt crises, we don't teach our students that governments default on domestic debt because government can always find local currency to pay. But Ghana presents an interesting case of domestic debt default, as highlighted here in the FT. So I'm going to connect this, of course, with the Guyana problematic of fiscal policy in the case of oil discovery. All right. So the big question, I think, on everyone's mind is, one, are the deficits too big, right? And how do we position that question in the context of absorption constraints? That's a term that's been used a lot. All right, so I hope to add some clarity to that. What we see here from 2009 to 2023 is the non-oil primary balance as a share of non-oil GDP. So primary balance means we're omitting or not including net interest payments. Yeah, and it's non-oil because it's just government expenditures minus tax revenue. Now, this is the best indicator of fiscal stance, right? The proof is in the pudding. After 2019, we can see a significant growth in fiscal deficits as a share of GDP, the non-oil primary fiscal deficit. This is the best indicator because if we were to use, for example, the overall primary balance or the overall balance, these things will change with oil revenue, right? So we don't know if they're moving because of a change in fiscal stance or just because of the oil market. The same is true if we use a non-oil fiscal balance to share GDP. GDP certainly will change with oil market conditions. So the big goal with this particular slide is to say, if we want to understand the fiscal position of any government with oil discovery, we need to look at the non-oil primary balance as a share of non-oil GDP. All right, indeed, before 2020, about 5% of GDP on average, was the size of the primary balance as a share of GDP. Now we know that it's approximating 30% in 2023. Significant jump from the norm of 5% on average thereabout. Significant jump. All right, so how is this deficit financed? Well, if you read the press, if you read the budget reports, it's financed by external debt, it's financed by domestic borrowing, and it's financed by withdrawals from the Natural Resource Fund. So that's so. All right, what we have here is data from 2009 to 2023. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is this dotted line. This dotted line is the size of total government expenditure, central government expenditure. The line below with the X is the Bank of Guyana financing of central government. If we were to divide Bank of Guyana financing of central government by total government expenditure, then we get the Bank of Guyana's share of deficit financing. All right, so for example, in 2014, total about 20% of government spending was financed by the Bank of Guyana. If you fast forward to about 2021, it's approximately 60%. Today, 2023, it's a little over 20%. The point I want to emphasize with this slide is that since 2014, based on IMF data, since 2014, an increase in share of total government spending is financed by the Bank of Guyana. That means it's not financed by domestic debt, it's not financed by external debt, it's not financed by withdrawals from the Natural Resource Fund. This is what we mean by monetization or money creation of the fiscal deficit. All right, some additional evidence of money-financed fiscal deficits. So we have this thing here called base money, and this is growth rate of base money. Now, base money comes from the central bank, all right? And there are two sources of base money. Whenever the central bank funds government spending, it increases reserves in the banking system. Or if the central bank buys foreign exchange from, say, GBTI or Republic Bank, it increases base money in the banking system. All right. So what I want to do here is to identify the source of the significant increase in base money. So in 2010, for example, the growth rate might have been about 5%. Today, it's about 60%. The growth in base money, which comes from the Bank of Guyana. Now, you can see with this dotted line here, this is the growth rate of net foreign assets in the Bank of Guyana. It's oscillating around zero. The key point is that the big growth in base money is not about accumulating foreign assets from the banking system. The solid line is other, according to the IMF, including Bank of Guyana net credit to the public sector. And you can see there's a tight relationship between the growth rate in central bank financing of the deficit and the growth rate in the base money. All right, so if base money is growing and it's growing because of monetization, then we can conclude with this slide and the previous slide that indeed fiscal deficits are money financed. All right, so there are two ways a central bank can finance the fiscal deficit. One, the central bank can buy bonds issued by the Treasury, credit the deposit account, and the government can spend from that deposit account. If we look, and that is indeed happening in the Guyana case. It's just not where the big action is. It's not where the big story is. The second source of money creation would be government simply writing checks and withdrawing reserves from the government deposit account at the central bank. So what I have here is the change in government deposit balance at the Bank of Guyana. A change means if it's falling, that is proof or evidence of monetization. We can see from 2010 to 2020, significant contraction in the change in government deposit balance at the Bank of Guyana, and the same is true in 2021. If there was no money financing, all right, then the change in government deposit balance would be zero, or it would be stationary along zero. Now, whenever there is a reduction in the government deposit balance at the Bank of Guyana, which is monetization, the central bank increases reserves in the banking system. When government writes a check, deposit increases in the banking system by that value, and reserves must rise. That increase in reserves is exactly what the commercial banks now use to buy T-bills, and we call that domestic debt. So the key question with this point is, do local banks in Guyana finance the fiscal deficit? If I give you $5 to buy shares in my company, have I borrowed $5 from you? All right. We can see here that this is external debt as a share of non-oil GDP. It's falling consistently. We can see from 2014, domestic debt share of non-oil GDP has risen tremendously. For example, in 2023, it's about 45% of non-oil GDP. In 2024, it's less than 15%. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when there's a reduction in government deposit balance at the Bank of Guyana, the banking system is flushed with reserves. It is these reserves that they use to buy treasury bills, and we call them debt. But this is not domestic debt in the conventional sense. Certainly not domestic debt when the US Treasury issues bonds, or the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer issues bonds, we call that domestic debt because it's being sold to households and firms. And the idea is we want to replace households and firms' demand with public demand. That is not what is happening with this increase in domestic debt. All right. Do remember that reserves that are used to purchase T-bills comes from the government. All right. So we've established that there is monetization of the fiscal deficits. The key question is, what are the effects? All right. The textbook thing is that monetized deficits, or indeed excessive deficits, should be inflationary, but that's only if the change in non-oil current account is equal to zero. In other words, if the government spends lots of money, we could sidestep the inflation problem by simply importing cheaper goods. Yeah. Now, of course, not everything we can import. So non-tradable inflation could increase. So we need to disaggregate the CPI inflation rate between tradable and non-tradable inflation. I don't have that data to present here, unfortunately. But as we can see, the GDP deflator, which would account moving beyond the consumer basket, meaning the rate of change of goods produced within the economy, goods and services, it's a tight relationship between that and the consumer basket. The consumer basket is a fixed basket of things we tend to buy each month. Very different from including the cost of investment goods, for example. All right, indeed, after 2020, we see a big surge or relative surge in inflation, but GDP skyrocketed. Sorry, GDP deflator skyrocketed relative to the CPI. Much of this, though, indeed is accounted for with improvement in terms of trade, meaning oil price increase. Yeah, so this is not necessarily a consequence of monetized deficits. What is interesting is comparing Guyana's inflation rate to its major trading partners. That would be Trinidad and Tobago, Japan, the United States, and China. In 2015, thereabout, it had the lowest inflation rate. That's obvious. But if you look beyond 2015, 16, 17, 18, 2021, etc., it's much higher than most of its trading partners. This is important because this affects the real effective exchange rate. All right. All right. So again, 2009, 2023. First thing, we observe a depreciation of the bilateral rate between Guyana and the US dollar. Right? Textbook thing, we do expect that from monetized deficits, right? Tend to depreciate the bilateral rate. There's an excess demand for foreign exchange, and that rate falls. All right. But it could also increase non-tradable inflation. And if that increase in inflation outstrips its competitors, then we could observe a real effective exchange rate appreciation. And that's what we see in the solid line since 2014. If you recall the previous slides, the IMF dates monetization in Guyana from 2014. So indeed, there is significant appreciation of the real effective exchange rate. One final point here is that as it relates to Dutch disease, lots have been said about Dutch disease in oil economies. The exchange rate that is relevant in this case is not the bilateral rate between Guyana and the US dollar. It is the real effective exchange rate, which is a weighted average exchange rate. So it accounts for changes in Guyana's nominal rate with its major trading partners, but also its inflation relative to its major trading partners. All right. So an appreciation of the real effective exchange rate, in theory, means its exports are becoming less competitive. All right. Now, from 2009 to 2023, we can see a significant growth in net domestic assets in the banking system, and that's what this dotted line is showing us. All right. This line with the circle is showing relative growth, indeed, of net foreign assets in the banking system. And if we were to divide the net domestic assets by the net foreign assets, we get what I call a bank diversification ratio or a bank diversification constraint. And that's this solid line. We can see after 2014, after the period of monetization, according to the IMF data, significant growth, right, in net domestic assets relative to net foreign assets in the banking system. Several points are important to raise here. First, this diversification ratio cannot rise without limit. Second, of course, banks are now more exposed to local assets relative to foreign assets. This third point is, if banks are accumulating net domestic assets at a much faster rate than net foreign assets, then we cannot conclude that banks are hoarding foreign exchange. If there's a foreign exchange issue, certainly it's not because of bad behavior per se by the bank. We're just not seeing this in the data.
Mm-hmm.
All right, time period is the same, 2009 to 2023. The dashed line is capturing the Bank of Guyana's net purchase or sale of foreign exchange to the local banking system. So for example, from 2009 to say 2013, the Bank of Guyana is selling foreign exchange to GBTI, Republic Bank, whatever. They're selling foreign exchange to the local market. Note carefully that this solid line is now capturing the volume of interbank foreign exchange trade in Guyana. So when the Bank of Guyana is selling foreign exchange to the banking system, interbank trade is also increasing. After 2017, the Bank of Guyana is net buying foreign exchange from the local market, meaning after 2017, in this period here, they're buying more than they're selling from GBTI, Republic Bank, what have you. When they do that, interbank volume of foreign exchange trade in the banking system is falling. So there seems to be an inverse relationship between net purchase and sale at the level of Bank of Guyana and interbank volume trade. And that's what we should expect, by the way. Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. So what this little chart captures is what are the banks doing when there is a net increase in aggregate demand coming from an increase in the fiscal deficit. So for example, on this axis here, we can see in this region and this region, there's a positive change in the non-oil primary bonds. Government is spending a lot more. If you recall the very first slide, I think it was, we moved from 5% of non-oil GDP to about 30% in 2023, right? So that's what's being captured in this region. Now, what's being captured in this axis is the amount of foreign exchange banks would bring back from the United States or from Europe. All right. So whenever there's a net increase in the fiscal deficit, we can see in the following years, 2019, 2020, 2023, 2014, 2011, 2012, in these particular years with bigger deficits, banks are actually bringing foreign exchange back to meet rising demand. Of course, if the fiscal deficit is going to increase, we're going to demand more locally produced goods and services, of course, more imports as well. So there's a net increase in aggregate demand for foreign exchange. And banks, I think, are doing what we expect banks to do, all right? That is to bring foreign exchange to meet the demand. This graph is also capturing, well, what does the Bank of Guyana do when there's a net increase in the fiscal deficit? So in 2019, 2020, 2022, 2023, 2021, significant increases in the fiscal deficit share of non-oil GDP. The Bank of Guyana is buying more foreign exchange than they're selling to the banking system. All right. So there are two things happening here. There's an increase in aggregate demand for foreign exchange because the fiscal deficit is much bigger. The Bank of Guyana is also buying more foreign exchange than they sell to the local banking system. And the net effect in these particular years would be an excess demand for foreign exchange. All right, this is my penultimate slide. This graph here is capturing foreign exchange intermediation by the banking system. So I divide the volume of foreign exchange sold by banks by the volume of foreign exchange purchased by banks in the local market. So a value of 1 would mean perfect foreign exchange intermediation. The quantity purchased is equal to the quantity sold, and that's what we want. That's certainly what we want in some dynamic sense. If it's above 1, it means banks are selling more than they're buying from the local market. So they're over-intermediating, if you will. If it's less than 1, banks are buying more than they sell from the local market. So they're under-intermediating, or there's disintermediation of foreign exchange. All right. Please note that in this data, from 2009 to 2023, the average value is 1. So over this time horizon, there is perfect intermediation of foreign exchange market. I have data for much longer years from 1990s to present, and it's the same value. So on average, banks are intermediating foreign exchange. Now we do observe two anomalies. 2014 and 2015, they net sell. They sell more than they buy in those two particular years. Barring those outliers, they tend to oversell and undersell, and in a dynamic sense, to ensure that they perfectly intermediate foreign exchange. So based on 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, there is normal bank behavior as it relates to foreign exchange intermediation. What we compare here, again, is the net increase in aggregate demand because of a significant increase in the fiscal deficit share of non-oil GDP. That's these two regions here. And we're capturing here the change in foreign exchange intermediation. So for example, if it's positive, banks are net selling to the market. If it's negative, they're net buying, or they're disintermediating or under-intermediating foreign exchange. All right, 2 or 3 points I want to emphasize. First, we can see that when there's a net increase or a fiscal stimulus, banks tend to net buy foreign exchange in the local market in the following years, 2019, 2011, 2023. So indeed, banks are buying more than they're selling into the private sector whenever there's a net increase in aggregate demand because of a bigger fiscal deficit. What I want to emphasize, however, is that this disintermediation here is more or less consistent with normal bank behavior. So 2023 and 2017 rather, not very different, all right? And that's exactly what we see with this graph, all right? They're above and below 1. I'm trying to average it out with a mean value of 1 over time. What is different, obviously, is the change in the fiscal balance. Look at 2020 Look at 2022, look at 2023. Of course, that has to do with a significant increase in the size of the fiscal deficit. So two things will produce an excess demand for foreign exchange here: significant growth in the size of the fiscal deficit and foreign exchange disintermediation. Except foreign exchange disintermediation is consistent with historical trend. So I'm going to conclude here, and I'm going to say that if we have excessive fiscal deficits, they tend to lead to all kinds of curses. I mean, I'm sure Guyanese are inundated with all manner of curses. Well, there could be a finance resource curse where there's a paradox of plenty, meaning, well, we're supposed to be rich with foreign exchange, but then we have a problem with access to foreign exchange. Or there could be a paradox of banking, the interest rates could rise and we expect banks to be flush with liquidity and interest rates should fall, right? These things tend to produce property booms and busts like we observe in Trinidad and many, many other countries. There are well-known real economy constraints that excessive deficits could violate and lead to accelerating inflation. It could lead to labor shortages, reallocation away from sectors that are not related to oil, from sectors that earn foreign exchange, right? Labor could move to high-wage sectors. Think of retail, think of construction. These things can lead to an appreciation of the real effective exchange rate and produce an excess demand for foreign exchange. But there are well-known institutional constraints in countries like Guyana: planning, execution. Ultimately, and this is whether we have oil wealth or not, fiscal policy should aim for neutrality on banks' diversification ratio, change the government deposit balance to the monetary base, of course, the foreign exchange market, that's our life and blood in our type of economies, and ultimately, central bank independence. We should end Bank of Guyana financing of the deficit. If we violate these neutrality rules and these other constraints, we can conclude safely that we have excessive fiscal deficits. Terence, thanks.
Well, you've given some real good food for thought. I'm particularly interested in your framing of the really one thinks about, one ought to be thinking about the non-oil GDP as the place in which you're looking to view trends over an extended period of time. And
right.
I'll reserve these thoughts for later. What I wanted to do now was to bring in Thomas, but I seem to note that his device seems he's here. Okay. His device was sort of not connected, and so I wanted to bring Thomas in. So Thomas, I hope you can appreciate kind of the structure in which I tried to organize to really get this technical view of what's happening, and to have you then sort of maybe connect this technical view to some of the things that you're observing within the context of Guyana, and also to kind of maybe elaborate on some of these technical matters that Colin has raised. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Would you mind if I were to share my screen?
Yes, you certainly can.
Let me do that, please.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges that we've sort of faced is that we haven't thought about these things from the perspective of the technical understanding of what's going on in this sense, and to begin to infuse.
Right. Terence,
just hit the present button.
Share screen, present button, and then share screen.
Yeah.
I need to go to a window.
Yeah. So perhaps take the window where you have the slides open.
Yes. I think I have it here. Are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, I can see the slides here.
Okay. And can you see the changes? Do you see the changing?
Yes, I can see we can see the movement. Yes.
Okay. Very well. So let me do this as best as I could. Thank you, Colin, for your presentation, and thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Terence, for the invitation. Yourself and the Business Journal. It's perhaps useful for us at this stage to step back a little bit from looking at the budget deficits, the fiscal deficits, to looking at the fiscal stance of the government on the whole. As you can imagine, the fiscal deficit comes about because of a need to finance something. That something has to do with the fiscal expenditure. And that's where I want to start. I'd like to suggest that, well, our fiscal expansion is coming year after year, and it's coming in a high growth context. I want to consider briefly what the sources of these high growth rates are, and to mention something that was mentioned before, the open economy context. So, a quick overview of the budget, very quick overview of the budget is given in these slides here. As indicated, it's a high growth context. Real GDP was projected and is projected to be 4.3% in 2024, coming on higher growth rates previously, obviously. And there is this year an even bigger fiscal program than the previous year. So we have to see this thing in the context of what we call aggregate demand, aggregate supply. What is this fiscal policy really doing? Fiscal policy is an element of the so-called aggregate demand that you're seeing in your screens right now. It's useful to point out that on this aggregate demand diagram, there's a measure on the y-axis of this general price level, and on the x-axis of an aggregate measure of output. Along with aggregate demand, there's aggregate supply. When there's a fiscal stimulus, what we have happening is, and I hope you could see it, Terence, this isn't working as I intended, but there will be an outward shift, a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the right along a particular aggregate supply curve. Everything depends on the shape of this aggregate supply curve. Because if it's flat, then there will be no inflation to worry about, and we'll just have an increase in output in GDP. But if, on the other hand, we had a vertical aggregate supply curve, any fiscal expansion and repeated fiscal stimuli will simply be eaten away by higher prices.
Yeah.
Now, aggregate demand, we need to pause a moment and see how government expenditure fits into this thing. The Y is GDP, and it's measured simply. This is one way of measuring it, but it's what's used. It's a sum of consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports, or exports minus our imports. So there is government expenditure here, and if there is an increase in G, in government expenditure, we will see a rise in GDP. If there is an increase in consumption, we rise in GDP. If there is an increase in exports, like oil exports, there will be a rise in GDP. What we've had happening in Guyana recently is an increase in two things. There's been an increase in exports, oil exports, with some implications for non-oil exports, and there has been an increase in G, government spending. This is the aggregate demand curve shifting outwards. And as I said before, if we can imagine a horizontal aggregate supply curve, meaning there's a lot of slack in the economy, well, we won't have to worry about inflation. But if, on the other hand, there's tightness in the economy, well, we wouldn't see this picture. We'll have a vertical aggregate supply curve, and we'll see the price level rising. That's what we teach to our students. And it's the context of fiscal expansion.
Can I ask you if you can you can use the slide present button so that it can be slightly bigger? I've had a comment come in that they're not able to.
I was actually doing that. I'm seeing it on my screen like that.
Oh, okay. So it's probably
That's
not
my.
coming.
It's not coming up. I apologize for that.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I
Shall I
just wondered.
shall I reshare my screen?
No, it's fine. I think we can safely.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
there you go. Yeah.
So is
Oh,
this better here like this?
yes,
Or
this is somewhat better.
so what I'm saying is that the sources of growth in Guyana have been an increase in net exports, but also in the context of this increase in our exports, of this booming economy, we've had fiscal expansions. Um, it's worth saying at this stage that in Norway, all of the oil revenues are saved. In other countries, there's a very specific fiscal rule that precludes what we call pro-cyclical spending. That is to say, when there is an increase in the windfall revenues, government spends more. In Guyana's context, we're not seeing any fiscal rule, and that is something to really worry about. We're governed by something in the Natural Resources Fund Act that says that we will spend to correct any development deficits that exist in our country. And if what I happen to be in Guyana right now, and I can see that it's as if we want to address our development gaps and deficits almost overnight. The main sources of development as we see it in Guyana right now would be the increase in economic activity in the country, due first of all to the all the activities related to oil and gas, but also the activities related to the increased fiscal program. By and large, that involves infrastructure, broadly speaking, covering a variety of sectors. So it includes the roads, the bridges, the school buildings, the hospital buildings. And in the private sector, it includes the shore bases and the other things that we see attendant to the increase in oil production. Among these, there are those elements of spending that would be tradable. They will result in our exports being enhanced. And then there are those sectors that are non-tradable, like a road. It might be a major highway and it might reduce transactions costs, but in and of itself, it's non-tradable. Same for buildings, you know. And these are probably the sources of growth that we are seeing. One thing that worries one about the fiscal program and any fiscal program is that it is being undertaken by the government as against by the market and market participants. As a result, there's less attention to having good feasibility studies. There are two examples of this that come to mind immediately. First of all, we've been told that it's a no-brainer that we'll have lower electricity costs if we did the gas to shore facility and the power plant.
Yeah.
But, whether or not that could happen without a feasibility study is because it is being undertaken by the fiscal entity, the state. Similarly, we've been told about a sugar refinery without hearing about fiscal studies, feasibility studies. In a book called Made in Africa, one of the points made was that for us to avoid in resource abundant economies, avoid the resource curse, one particularly important thing is for us to do very strong fiscal studies before we undertake any fiscal program. So the question arises, how sustainable are our sources of growth? What if the oil disappears? Would we have the human capital to replace that oil? Have we been investing in technology? Have we been focusing on the kind of technology that enhances productivity? As I showed you in that equation, C plus I plus G, we can have growth that is not really related to productivity enhancements. If that is the case, our growth might not be sustainable. And finally, the open economy context here. On the left-hand side, there are these net exports that you saw in the previous equation.
So
Those net exports,
want to click on that's on slide 8. If you click on slide, can you click on slide 8? Because I think that's on slide 8. There we go. We can now see.
I think my mistake was that I was going to presentation and I should have been just keeping it like this. So this is my final slide. On the left-hand side is the X minus M, the X being our exports, like our oil exports. We've had an increase in imports, the FPSO, the concrete, the steel, every single thing else that we need to import as part of the fiscal program, as well as the private sector activities. Now, Guyana has been running an overall balance of payments deficit. That means to say, we've been running a deficit on this equation that you see on the left-hand side there, the so-called current account. In sort of a textbook environment, we would assume and we would say that these net exports, if they're in deficit, if our imports exceed our exports, it would be financed by some mechanism. And we call that the capital account to the balance of payments. There would be foreign direct inflow, foreign direct investment inflows, for example. Those would be our foreign exchange inflows and receipts. Now, what I'm saying is that overall, adding together those two accounts, we've got deficits on the current account to the balance of payments, as well as the capital account. And that is a source of significant worry. It's probably one of the reasons why we aren't noticing an increase in the Bank of Guyana net foreign assets, because the Bank of Guyana has to be using up international reserves to meet the deficit. But on the right-hand side, they're subscripted there. You'd see both P as well as G on those two terms. These are savings investment gaps. And the G refers to the government. That is to say, if the government runs a deficit, the one that Colin was talking about, that deficit could result in a current account deficit on the balance of payments that has to be financed. Now, that's our open economy context. And it is one of the reasons why we have to be very careful about the way we spend our resources, because if you remember well, Guyana in the late 1970s experienced a commodity boom. And what we ended up doing is we ended up nationalizing everything and trying to roll out a development program that we thought would have fed, clothed, and housed the nation. It was the same idea, we had a windfall from our bauxite and our sugar. Now, that's the risk, the incentive risk of that confronts government. And we have to be wary of that. I won't repeat what Colin said about the real exchange rate, which was our next comment there, but maybe in the discussion we could talk about that we face the risk of losing international competitiveness, whether we have a fixed exchange rate or a flexible one. So that's the context I thought I'd provide, Terence.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And I think you've cued Samuel in a really inappropriate way. So first, let me say, Samuel, it's a pleasure to meet you in person. I've read of some of the articles that you've written in the public press in Jamaica, and I think Thomas has sort of cued your presentation perfectly. As he notes, we have seen this windfall business before, and so and perhaps we have not engaged in the right sort of fiscal policy direction. And so I want you to take a moment to kind of give us a sense of your perspective of the fiscal policy and its potential moving forward. Samuel, the floor is yours.
All right. Good morning, Terence, and thank you for the invitation. I don't have a PowerPoint slide. I deliberately decided not to create one. Yes?
No, you don't create one at all. It's not required.
Right.
It
Yeah.
helps
So
to-
my approach to this discussion this morning is one of a political economy view. And that's a risky approach, but I'll take it nevertheless. So the topic you asked me to speak on is simply policy formulation in the face of prosperity. How do we shape fiscal policy amidst an economic boom and avoiding the resource curse? First, I want to make clear for the benefit of your audience that when we talk about fiscal policy, what we're talking about are simply government policies regarding taxation and expenditure. Yes? So anything related to those two broad areas is what we mean when we speak about fiscal policy. The resource curse. We've heard a lot about it, but sometimes I'm not sure we're entirely clear what it is about, especially within the context of the Dutch disease. So these ideas get conflated and the like. But anyway, so the resource curse is really an umbrella term. Many years ago, I think around 1995, Jeffrey Sachs, in an article, Sachs and Warner to be exact, so two economists, what they noted was that countries, developing countries, yes, especially, that have an abundance of natural resources, did not perform as well as their counterparts with less resources. Yes? And so, hence the resource curse, that you have so much by way of resources, but you're not performing as well as countries that have less than you, essentially. Now, the Dutch disease, which is a term coined decades ago, before the Sachs and Warner paper, spoke to a situation which developed in the Netherlands. They had an oil boom, and as a result of that oil boom, there was an appreciation of their exchange rate. And so what that meant, therefore, was that their non-oil products, their non-oil exports, were now more expensive for foreigners to purchase. Yes? So in other words, you can imagine a situation where, okay, the price foreigners would have to pay for goods coming from Holland at that time would have been impacted by the fact that the exchange rate in Holland would have been more more expensive for foreigners. And so if it's more expensive, the foreign currency, so too would be the goods, right? That is economics 101. I wish to state at this point, however, that in the case of Guyana, I am not entirely sold on this idea that should there be an appreciation of the Guyana dollar, let's say a real appreciation, that it would negatively impact our non-oil exports, right? As the textbooks say. And I stand corrected if anyone can show otherwise. And I'll tell you why I say this. Guyana is a small island developing state. And that might sound strange to people, but even though we're not an island, in United Nations classification, we are considered a small island developing state. So as a small island developing state, Guyana cannot impact international prices. So in other words, Guyana is a price taker, you see? So when the Guyana dollar appreciates in value, or should it appreciate in value, I don't imagine that would have any real impact on our non-oil exports. Yes? In a sense, economists would say that, the demand for our products are perhaps inelastic, our exports, that is, yes, non-oil exports or what have you. So, when we talk about the Dutch disease, so what I'm talking about here is the Dutch disease. When we talk about the Dutch disease, I think we have to be careful the channel through which it can impact on Guyana. And so far, I'm not yet convinced. I'm not saying, it can't happen, but from my understanding of Guyana as a small island developing state, I don't buy this argument about exchange rate appreciations causing our exports to become competitive. We're small. We can hardly compete with our neighbors next door, much more the larger countries in the world. Yes? The Chinas and other countries in Asia, right? So I question that. However, Dutch disease type effects have occurred in Guyana. There's a famous paper, well, it might not be so famous, but a paper written a few years ago, around 2017 there, about the name of the authors escaped me at this time. I think one is Lang, but don't quote me on that entirely. But what they showed in their paper, they said, look, they used the boom in the gold sector versus what was happening in terms of agriculture. And what they argued was that people were, labor was leaving the agricultural sector and going into the gold fields. So there it is. You have an example of the Dutch disease type effect, that a boom in one sector is causing a reduction in output in another sector, right? And that had nothing to do per se with a change in the competitiveness of Guyana's exports because of an exchange appreciation or anything like that. So I just want to make the point that the Dutch disease, while the original example had to do with an appreciation of the exchange rate, it is not the only way you can view the Dutch disease, all right? Moving on. The next point I wish to make is that of the importance of institutions. When I think of fiscal policy in Guyana, when I think of this idea of the resource curse and how we can avoid it, my mind turns to institutions. Now, it is important to stop here for a moment and explain what I mean by institutions, because it is not, I don't think it's always very clear as to what an economist, for example, means when he or she speaks about institutions. Now, I'm going to use the definition by Douglas North, a famous American economist and winner of the prize in economic sciences. Douglas North defines institutions as the rules of the game in a society, or more formally, the humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction. And so perhaps a very good example of an institution would be our legal framework, our legal institutions. Yes? So to avoid the resource curse, yes, we have to be very careful as regards how we deal with our institutions, how we deal with the rules of the game, right? And it's not only legal, political institutions are critically important. So to give an example, and I'm treading here on very thin ice, but I'll go here. In recent months, or probably years, we have seen where President Ali is very visible. And I must, all due respect for him, for going to various communities, talking to the Guyanese people, and so on. And of course, it's good politics, yes? But while the visits he's making is good, there's a concern I have, right? With all due respect to him, I am concerned that if he's not careful, he will undermine local government institutions. So if I had to give him one recommendation, I would say this. In every region of Guyana, in every localized area, what you need is a constant engagement between the people in these communities and their local government representatives. And ever so often, and these meetings can be held perhaps once a month or once a quarter, but or every 2 months, or whatever is useful, yes? And President Ali can now visit these local government areas at a time when they are supposed to have their local meetings. And if I were advising him, I would say too, don't sit at the head table, sit in the audience and listen and follow the meeting. And of course, the president is there, people will be on their good behavior and so on. And of course, as the president, he must be allowed to engage with the people. But what he wants to show the populace is that, look, local government officials are important and we must allow those processes to work. Yes? And so if it needs be that he's displeased with something, it makes no sense, right? To pull some official out of the crowd and ask him or her questions there, because these matters are very delicate. That is why, if I see somebody commit some crime, the police or the courts just don't take it based on what I say and that person is sent to jail. There's a process that has to be followed. Again, the institution, that legal framework. Yes? So I would say to him, be very careful not to undermine institutions. The last point I wish to make has to do with industrial policy. Industrial policy has been with us for quite a long time. There's some economists who pretend that industrial policy is not a good approach because the private sector should be the engine of growth and all these lofty things. But I will say to those economists that what we have to recognize is that the big United States, the bastion of capitalism, industrial policy is alive and well. So the problem for me is not whether or not industrial policy should be used. The question is, how is it implemented? Now, what is industrial policy? It has to do with strategic policy interventions by a government to promote specific industries or sectors of an economy. And here is where we have to applaud President Ali and the government of Guyana for what they have said as regarding agriculture. Because here it is, within the context of this oil boom, and we talk about, the resource curse, or more specifically, Dutch disease. In the case of the Dutch disease, we do not want to see a scenario where the oil sector becomes so dominant that it kills our agricultural sector, right? So for him to talk about reducing our agricultural imports by 2025 and by partnering with CARICOM, that is an initiative I think is noteworthy and should be applauded. You see, of course, the devil is in the details, as they say, so we still need to see what is happening in that regard. But I do agree with that approach. Yes. Now, how should one effectively go about industrial policy? Interestingly, a few days ago, a famous economist, Danny Roderick, had a piece in the Financial Times, and he laid out, a few things. One of the things he said is that when it comes to industrial policy, a government should not do too much, right? So you don't want to be doing very many things. Of course, in the case of Guyana, I do recognize that the government is playing a game of catch-up. There's so many things that needs to be done to move Guyana forward, right? But at the same time, one has to be careful how much is done, right? So if the focus is to radically transform our agricultural sector, I say yes, okay, focus on that. This doesn't mean that other things can't be done, like in the field of education or what have you. But I think we can all agree, if what we're hearing is correct, that agriculture seems to be that route where we want to see some radical change, and with that I am fine. So that is one of the things Danny Roderick would suggest. Danny Roderick would also suggest that one should engage critically with the private sector on these matters. So even though yes, it's government's initiative or what have you, there has to be that balance in terms of engaging the private sector in these initiatives. All right, but I'll stop there. I think I've said.
No,
thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you for bringing. I think you've cued Justin up perfectly. Justin, small island developing states, their susceptibility to a Dutch disease, in the sense that Samuel has laid this out, and I think we've already begun to see some aspects of that in the context of Guyana, which is the oil and gas sector absorbing much more of the workforce from the other areas, and then it's a question of the development of strong institutions, and the question of industrial policy that is, and I think, and I want to say, just as the reason that you came to my sort of attention was I saw you once in this program talk about sort of the importance of education as a kind of broad policy for the Caribbean in an economic sense. And I thought that you had this right on the head. So I want to give you a chance to, just weigh in on Guyana, weigh in on the fiscal policy from your perspective as someone who sat as the director of economics for the Caribbean Development Bank.
Okay, thank you very much, Terence. It's a pleasure to be here, and just want to check that you're hearing me fine.
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, so let me just share my screen. Okay, maybe I'll just share the file.
Yeah, I think it's easier if you share the slide, just the slides.
Yes. Just bear with me.
You got it.
Okay. It's saying that it's just processing at the moment, so I'll just wait for it to come up.
Here.
Yes. Yeah, so, well, while that's processing, I will present, of course, on the need for sustainable growth. Is that there now? Can you see it? Great. I hope the audience members can see that screen now. Okay. So I'll be presenting on the sustainable growth and the need for diversification for Guyana. And what I will attempt to do as I look through my agenda is really to give you a recap. And I think it's important to us to always remind ourselves that all developing countries are working towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And to do a recap of where Guyana is with respect to the SDGs and the economy, and then how can Guyana achieve sustainable growth and diversification. And then at the end, I really just want to touch a little bit on the Essequibo area and the importance of that particular topic for Guyana at this point in time. So here's a recap of Guyana's SDGs and economy. So if I look at this here, and what we've attempted to do in this slide is really to review all 17 SDGs and to ascertain where Guyana is currently. At the bottom of that slide, I actually have the key, as it were, as to how to interpret each of these slides. So, of course, an upward arrow, it suggests that the country is on track on trying to, or maintaining that SDG achievement. That arrow, that yellow arrow that is slightly going towards the northeast is showing again that where Guyana is with respect to moderately improving. An arrow pointing to the east, that is pointing to your right, shows that it is stagnating on that particular SDG. And again, I don't have data, unfortunately, for SDG 10 and SDG 12, but for all of the others. So in the main, what we're seeing is that Guyana is working towards, but also stagnating in some important SDGs. But however, on that number one SDG of no poverty, it is making progress and should be on track to maintaining or achieving that particular SDG. Of course, no country ever has zero poverty, but certainly I think Guyana is on track to make some good progress with respect to that particular indicator. And of course, that will only be boosted by the exploitation of its oil and gas reserves. And if, for example, the resource rents from that can be distributed more evenly. I know that that's a great if based on the other presentations that were done before me, but it's important for us to understand that there is the potential for Guyana to achieve great things with respect to SDG 1. So as I move along, we all know that Guyana's economy is primarily driven by the growing mining and quarrying sector. And it has always had a growing mining and quarry sector. But now in particular, with the advent of oil and gas, and well, not gas as yet, but oil production, we can see that that is driving significant economic growth within Guyana, certainly over the last 2 years that I have data available for there. So as you can see there, mining and quarrying is now taking up the bulk of the contributions to GDP, real GDP within Guyana. And of course, as I said before, specifically the oil and gas sector, since the discovery of substantial oil reserves offshore Guyana in 2015, and of course again in 2018, as you can see here. Now, one of the things, unfortunately, with oil and gas, and that is the way how we tend to exploit mining resources, particularly in our countries, is that in all other types of economic activities, we find that most value added is distributed to workers as wages and to owners as profits. However, when it comes to oil and gas distribution of rents within the country, those rents go first to the government, who will then need to redistribute them through public spending. And I think it's really important for the audience members to understand that difference, because oil and gas on its own, while contributing significantly to real GDP growth, oil and gas does not really contribute directly to wages and profits within the country. It is the distribution of the revenues that the government will receive from those oil and gas discoveries that will then determine how that impacts the society at large. So then it becomes really important for the government to distribute those revenues in a sustainable way, in a way that will tend to project economic efficiency, but also, I would say, economic diversification, but also in a fair way, so that we have an equal distribution of those rents as far as possible. Now, resource-based development, like oil and gas, does not bring more jobs. At least it's what I should say, direct jobs. But as you can see here, the share of employment across sectors remains largely the same as it did before Guyana started to produce oil. And we still have a significant amount of persons working in lower paying wholesale and retail trade and in the agriculture, forestry, and fishing sectors. Now, one of the things...
And this is precisely the point that I've been trying to get. This is the nub that I want us to kind of unlock. Exactly the slide that this is what the program in some large sense has been about. You know, like you have these rents go to the government. The government has to redistribute them, but it has to redistribute them in a economically sound, stable, sustainable manner. And how do you do that? That's the question that we've been trying to answer.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm happy. Well, this slide in particular shows you that a bulk of the employment is still in those sort of lower, yes, yeah. in the lower paying sectors. But what tends to happen in this type of economy, and I think it was alluded to by the previous presenter, is that you would probably have wage inflation that then leads to this Dutch disease, or what I learned many years ago as a mechanism of a petroleum economy by the great economist Dudley Sayers. For me, that gives a much better understanding as to what happens. It really, the oil and gas sector, because it pays such high wages, but because it employs so few people, many people then say that it then drives this inflation within the economy. And more workers in other sectors then demand higher salaries. And that in effect can then drive this problem of making those other sectors uncompetitive. And so this is why I think Guyana in particular, based on what the other presenter says, has to be very mindful, based on some of the goals and the objectives that the government has set out, certainly not only for itself, but at a CARICOM level, to be much more self-reliant on food and to reduce the food import bill, that is going to have to be very mindful of that. And so Terrence, one of the things I really want to say here is that it will not only be about redistributing the rents in a fair and sustainable and an efficient way, but also understanding that all other sectors that are important in the economy need to be facilitated, just as oil and gas is being currently facilitated. I've seen that too often in the Caribbean context, whereby the main sectors get all of the attention from our governments, but other supporting sectors like agriculture do not get the attention, and so eventually wilt and die. And that is something that I think Guyana, because it's such a wonderful opportunity for it to become, we've always said, the breadbasket of the region. If it is to become that, the government will also have to pay specific facilitation mechanisms to that sector. And now, Guyana's growing economy will provide significant opportunities for the private sector to grow. But unfortunately, and this comes back to my point that I was just making, the business climate is quite unfavorable. And so if it is only the oil and gas sector that is experiencing a very good business environment, well, then, of course, the economy will become a monocrop economy, where the government then gets revenues from that and then tries to distribute it all over. And so while that can be good in some ways, you do really want to have the other sectors being competitive as well, and so growing and also providing their own high wages. And because of the poor business environment, it is this point that I really want to make, that we need to ensure that the government is also facilitating business development and competitiveness in all sectors across the economy, and not only in the oil and gas sector. Yes. Now, we know Guyana has urgent need for intensive investment in public infrastructure, particularly in areas such as roads, electricity, and clean water. And I think with the oil and gas resources, this can be a way for the government to spend those resources in a way that provides efficiency, but in a way that can also help facilitate economic activity in other sectors. And besides that, there's probably an opportunity here for the government to not only be the sole financier of these types of projects, but to seek to build partnerships, perhaps with local private sector companies, for the building out of some of this infrastructure, and thereby, through government procurement, enable a development of other sectors that will help the diversification of the economy. And so what we have tended to see in the past in many countries, that the government simply finance all of these things themselves. And perhaps there are some contractors who would win huge projects, but yet the real skills, the real capability and capacity associated with building out this infrastructure might be lost. And I think there's a great opportunity for the government to consider how it goes about building out this much needed infrastructure through significant partnerships with the private sector. And may I dare say that I know that there's a local content policy in place for the oil and gas sector, but perhaps in building out some of these very important infrastructure, that the government might want to consider some sort of local content policy on this as well, so that Guyanese firms build out the capacity and indeed have the capability to do this within the country. And then eventually, because of that government procurement, like what Japan had done years ago through its procurement, its firms were then able to go outside of Japan and to conquer additional markets. I think Guyana has an opportunity to do that if the government procures well and ensures that its local firms participate in this. So how can Guyana achieve sustainable growth and diversification? These are just some of the points I really want to say. We have also looked at Guyana's Human Development Index. At the moment, it's not as high as some of its other Caribbean counterparts, and government needs to pay particularly important focus on this. And it comes back to that point that you were making, Terrence, when you were introducing me. As you know, education is something that I tend to harp on a lot. And it's very important that the government invests significant amount of money into education. So sometimes I run into many arguments with some of my fellow economists about how governments should go about spending money that they come into. And I always say I don't see any problem with spending excessively on education if you want to build out human capacity. And in terms of human capital, it is not only education, but I think significant expenditure on health as well. That is to say, on preventative health measures, but also on providing world-class health facilities so that Guyanese can be healthy and also productive at the same time. So I think that a lot of money should be spent on these areas to bring them up to where they are. I see no problem in a government spending significantly on this, as long as, of course, it is done in a transparent and, of course, in a sustainable way. But right now, I think Guyana needs to spend significantly on education, and perhaps work with its other Caribbean counterparts in reformulating the CXC curricula. The Caribbean needs a total revamp of its education curricula based on what our children will need to be competitive in this century. And I'm almost finished. I just have 2 more slides. How can Guyanese enhance their development prospects? Well, I've tried to summarize here in a few bullet points: development and operationalization of medium-term investment strategies. And I think here is an opportunity to also integrate those partnerships that I've spoken about, to consider if there's possibility from some type of local content within that, of course, within the legal constraints of that, to ensure that Guyanese firms and Guyanese people benefit from the build out of this infrastructure. Because what tends to happen traditionally is that governments would simply subsidize electricity or subsidize water and say to the people of those countries, well, that's how you're benefiting from the oil and gas resources. But I think that there's an opportunity here in the medium-term investment strategy to say that we are going to procure via local firms and ensure that local people get those jobs, and so building out the capacity. Yes. So there are many ways. Increasing infrastructural investments, as I spoke about, enhancing human capacity. And here I just really want to harp on the need for building out human capital. And that also includes investing in health and avoiding what I call the MOPE, the mechanism of an open petroleum economy, which we can discuss during the questions and answers. And then finally, my last slide. In the immediate term, Guyana needs to maintain stability and ensure good governance. And here I've just added some of the points that I need to touch on here. For example, that risk of flooding, how do you mitigate that? Looking at the divisions in politics. And again, one of the earlier presenters discussed a little bit on building out institutions, which I think was a very, very good point, which I need to also endorse as well. And I do have a few more slides, but I really don't think I need to speak too much on the Essequibo area. But just to say that this whole area of carbon credits is an area that Guyana should try to build on, and to see how it can also draw in additional funds, and so diversify the government's revenue streams away from oil and gas as well. Yes, and the so-called risks associated with Essequibo. So Terence, I've tried to just stay within my 15 minutes, and thank you very much for having me.
This one could go on forever for me, because I think this really hits at the nub of the problem. We've been doing, this is the 2nd season, so 12 months, and it's program number 9, so 12, 7, 19. So we've done 19 of these things, and really at the core has been this question that you hit on in that slide. And it's the structural game that I think is creating so much anxiety in Guyana. This particular industry results in the rents from this industry go to a bank in New York City, and the signatories on that bank are the government of Guyana, whoever the government of Guyana is. And it is that entity that then has the challenge of figuring out how to redistribute this wealth in some meaningful, sustainable way. And there are all of these sort of people calling upon, for example, the question you mentioned a moment ago, the need to invest in health and education. Well, I mean, at this moment, and what made the way in which higher salaries in the oil and gas industry sort of drives higher salaries in the rest of the economy. Our teachers are on strike. It seems that it should be a no-brainer that we should pay teachers whatever they demand, and logic. But there also seems to be an issue here where the question is, what is the optimum way to balance that, so that when you spend the money on infrastructure, when you spend the money on education, when you spend the money on health, how do you do it so that it's sustainable over a long time and everyone benefits? And this is, for us, it's a challenge, and one can see it in the Guyanese newspapers on a daily basis. And so, in a way, it cues you for us, Bright. Ghana has been a place that many of us have looked to as an example. Colin's very first slide spoke to the experience of Ghana, and I think it, Justin is sort of coming back to, in some ways, what has been the Ghanaian experience. And so I wanted to ask you, Bright, help us understand this from your perspective, and offer some guidance to us Guyanese who are, we're a small island state who susceptible to the Dutch disease, maybe not so strong institutions, trying to shift our industrial policy to agriculture and to better support education. Give us your thought from that perspective. And again, thank you for joining us. Floor is
Thank
yours,
you very
Brian.
much, Terence. My presentation is still loading. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, wonderful. My presentation is still loading. Unfortunately, it looks very slow, maybe a minute or so before it does. So maybe I'll use this time for the preliminary pleasantries. First of all, I'm very delighted and honored that Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium decided to invite me to share with you a much more non-Guyanese perspective. What I've intended to do with this little time that I have is to provide a much more global framework within which we can look at some of the more compelling issues, some of which have already come up, some very compelling presentations so far. So it's a more wide-ranging kind of touch on a lot of things very quickly, but try and weave a thread through it. And it's that thread that I think will be very important in terms of ideas that will leave people that have decided to spend all these many minutes with us. So while the presentation loads up, I would say a little bit about Imani. We are a think tank based in Accra. We initially were very focused on Ghana, but over time we realized that a lot of the issues that confront developing countries in the global south, are very similar, and therefore we need to take a more global perspective in the way that we look at these things. So we become more comparative in the way that we do our analysis, and some of the work that I'll be sharing therefore will not be only Ghana-centric. I'll crave for a little bit of time, just maybe a little bit above the allocated time, so we can touch on some of the themes that have popped up, but from a global perspective. So the upload has been done and is processing. I think it's not too long ago that, and Colin did mention that that Ghana was being celebrated around the world for very similar reasons to Guyana. In 2007, we discovered oil. Having discovered oil and therefore our credit having improved, we also discovered the Eurobond market. So two things happened at the same time. We discovered oil and we discovered the Eurobond market. And in the 3 years subsequent, we moved it to production. We fast-tracked development of the oil fields. And in 2010, the first oil fields went live. In the subsequent period, a number of additional fields have come on board. Fascinatingly, there's not been a major discovery in Ghana now for more than 6 years. So it tells you that you can have a boom period, and then you can have so my slides are now up, and perhaps you can add it to the screen.
Yeah. Here we are.
Wonderful. So what it does tell you very clearly is that you can have a boom period of massive oil discoveries. So you discover Stabroek, then you discover Lisa, then you discover this and that, and then you can have a very long drought in which discoveries just don't happen, because some of this stuff is stochastic, some of this stuff is random in terms of what fields you discover and don't discover. So Ghana had this celebratory moment in which it was a big story, like Colin has pointed out. And then, as most of you that are familiar with the continent, Africa, that's what I mean, I know it's been quite a very few devastating years for Ghana. It defaulted on its international loans, and things have not been so shiny. As far as my talk is concerned, I'm here to discuss institutional imagination. I'm here to try and convince you that it's much more, shall I say, flexible from a point of view of the cognitive constructs that we need to deal with when thinking about how to advance this potential bonanza that Guyana has had. And Roberto Ongar is an academic at Harvard that I like a lot. And he likes to try and convince us that because institutions have an inertial content, there's inertia in institutions, we tend to think of them as, received from the mind of God. But the truth of the matter is that institutions are very flexible. And what I'll be trying to show you is that around the world, there have been very different ways of trying to do some of the things that you're talking about. Making sure that Guyana doesn't get cheated by multinational oil corporations, check. There's a ton of ways you can go about and do that. Making sure that redistribution happens effectively, check. There's a ton of ways in which you can go around doing that. So that flexibility in terms of thinking of how the institutions work is very important. That also means, of course, that there's no absolute best practice. This is a quick overview of different countries in the world and the mechanisms that they use. In Guyana, you use a royalty and a profit sharing model. In some places, it's more production sharing in its more traditional sense. In some places, it's joint venture driven. In some places, it's more concessions based. There's so many different ways in which you can organize your natural resources, including in petroleum. And so recognizing that, it doesn't really matter how developed the country is, how not developed the country is, you still have heterogeneity is very important. So there are countries that are, fairly advanced like Norway, but that has institutions that are fairly similar to those like Brazil or Suriname. And then there are countries that are very advanced like Canada or the US, which have systems that are very similar to, say, Ghana. So we have to be very careful in terms of our understanding of what it is to come up with a best practice model. Even before you start producing, you will see that there is considerable variety in terms of how you structure the actual contracting and licensing process around the world. And therefore, when you look at fiscal burdens, so I saw that in Guyana, there's been a huge debate about how the first field, which is Stabroek, how the fields that were found in Stabroek, the royalty arrangements was too small, 2%. And people have talked about the fact that, Guyana was cheated. But yes, it is true that, 2% is very low for royalties. But if you go around the world, there's a significant variety in terms of what the tax rate looks like, in terms of what the royalty looks like. And I will say that, and I'll say a bit more about that as I move forward. It's very important that you don't obsess over any specific fiscal number. When it comes to the legal structuring of these deals, it's also important that you recognize that there is massive variability in fiscal stability, for instance. This is a mechanism by which the big companies try to prevent being taken by surprise. So they try to make sure that in the agreements, they have stability of provisions. Now, even how you do that, there are hybrid mechanisms, there are limited mechanisms, there are mechanisms that allow you to look at specific indicators and when they show up, etc., etc. So as Guyana continues to do more licensing, there is still room for civil society. There's still room for people like the Policy Consortium and the media, as well as thought leaders like yourself, parents, to continue to push on this issue around what is the creative content of some of these structuring. Yes, it's fine to have a model agreement for people to have predictability of how things work, but within model agreements, the parameters that can shift, especially in relation to fiscal stability, can still manifest really amazing variability. So there's a lot of thinking that's still left to be done about how you do when it comes to the remaining resources that are in the ground. And if you look at the other countries and the way they've done it, you'll be surprised that for an industry that is seen as very standardized around the world, that this variety keeps popping up everywhere you go. So there's a lot of creative thinking that is still left to be done when it comes to structuring these contracts at every level, not just in production, but in marketing, etc. Another thing is what I said earlier, which is that don't obsess over single numbers. Don't take the royalty number and say, oh, it's 2%. Okay, now we have a new regime, which is 10%. That's slightly better, or it's 20%, or tax rate is this, or profit sharing rate is this. That is not the way to do it because it's a multi-dial system. The different indicators work together to create a final output. So royalty is important, But so also is the tax rate, so also is the profit sharing rate, so is your cost recovery model. So there are so many different indicators that go into this mechanism that by doing the dials right, setting the dials right, it's a bit like flying an aircraft, right? Setting those dials right and making sure you're doing it well can lead to outcomes that are much more different than you thought before. So that's very important to bear in mind. And like I've said, the fiscal instruments are really diverse. You can tune them and you can redial them, you can shift them. But then that then implies that you have to have modeling, which is where you come in, Terence. The mathematicians have a role to play here. You need to have these really rigorous modeling exercises where you say, okay, if you change this, this is how it affects all the other parameters. And then when that happens, when there's a change in parliament, there's a change in cabinet, you don't wait till you have a whole debate before, because you can simply go into that model and tweak a couple of parameters and say, here are some of the outputs, and have a much more structured debate within civil society and within academia about the impact of specific policy changes. So that kind of modeling should be done in civil society, should be done in academia. You should make sure that when they change parameters within the regimes, whether it's fiscal regime or legal regime, you know immediately how that will affect the different outputs that are important to you. And that also means that you take a whole of government and whole society approach, because it's a system. It's not just production. It's not just taxation. It's not just local content. It's not just linkages into the rest of the economy. It's all of these things together. Talent has a role to play in the rest of it. But without the modeling, without the ability to connect one to the other, and without people like yourself and others on this call having that broad perspective of how the interconnections work, it makes dialogue difficult. It makes it hard for you to challenge whether or to debate whether a particular fiscal policy or a particular legal policy makes sense or not. And it follows then, if we think along these lines, that states take the amount of money, the absolute amount of money that goes to the government is not the only thing to obsess over. There is just often in the broad media too much emphasis on how much the government gets overall. And you can look at it and see that, if you take a couple of countries in Africa, it's not necessarily the ones where the government gets the most money that are the best governed. And that is very interesting just looking at that on the screen. Some of the best governed countries, some of the strongest countries in the region are also the ones where the government doesn't get as much out of the oil. But remember, back to my model, the government may not be the only key player in this regard. There are other factors at play. So you have to look in and think through how are the benefits distributed broadly in economic terms, in employment terms, and in other variables like technology transfer, etc., and how do those weave together to create a truly transformative outcome. So we come to Guyana, and I guess the specials in Guyana is that you are a very small country with a very small population, so the oil wealth distributed per capita is overwhelming. And most of you must have seen this graph that suggests that on a per capita basis, you are now truly, truly remarkable as a country. Now, that
is the problem. On a per capita basis, it seems, but the systems that you just described,
yes.
the comments in the thing that you said, please ask your guests what are the dials for Guyana, because we're not seeing this output that you.
I'll get to that very shortly. So here is the big picture now for Guyana. You get 2% of the money, and that is on the top. You take 2% of the top. You cream 2% of the top. And then after everything has happened, costs have been taken care of, etc., some profit remains, and then you take 50%. In a way, that was for the biggest find. For the new find, you get 10% of the top, or you cream 10% of the top, and then after all the costs have been taken care of, you get 50% of the profit. What that means is very simple. It means that, first of all, in terms of competitiveness, you are still one of the most competitive destinations, but that's from the investor's point of view. So from the investor's point of view, you are great. They want to come and do more business there. Okay. The second point, though, is that a lot now relies on how effective you would be from an institutional point of view of monitoring the cost. Because without knowing the cost effectively, you don't know what the profit is, right? And you are sharing the profit, and that is the biggest chunk of your return, sharing the profit. So it means, therefore, that the profit calculation, the profit modeling becomes extremely interesting. And already you are fighting about costs. You already have a situation where
I was about to tell you that this is a big place in the past and in the current.
Indeed, you're already fighting over costs. So that already tells me that there is room in Guyana to learn from all of us who've had to be dealing with this cost issue for many, many years around the world. And we know the issues, right? Base erosion, cost inflation, profit attrition. What does that mean? What that means is it's very simple. These big multinationals that are, mining your oil or drilling your oil, they have global operations, and they have the ability to shift certain services elsewhere where the taxes are low, and bring services into Guyana when they think your taxes are high, or when they think the profit sharing dynamic means, therefore, that they need to inflate costs. Now, inflating costs is a very, very technical dance. Now, that technical dance requires a number of important parameters, which I'll try and mention a couple of them. We don't just have the time to delve into this, but I'll mention a couple of them, and that's important. And it ultimately leads to a situation where you have less profit oil. If you have less profit oil, Guyana has less money. If you have too little money, it ends up that all the nice, beautiful plans around sustainability and the rest of it can't be implemented because you can't finance them. It's as simple as that. So first case study, Congo. One country in Africa that a lot of people confuse with the other Congo. So there's a much bigger Congo that's like maybe 100 million people. That's next door. Probably the richest country in the world per capita when it comes to natural resources generally. But this Congo is a smaller country next to it. And sometimes we distinguish them by saying Congo-Brazzaville and then Congo-Kinshasa. Congo-Kinshasa being the big one. So this Congo-Brazzaville has been producing oil for a very long time. And one of the things that they've discovered is that almost always retrospective audits show that the multinationals inflate their costs. And there are tax concessions that they shouldn't have got, that they get. And part of the challenge that we've seen is because the overall process of how you set it up to do the audit means it takes too many years. So by the time you discover that, there's been, this cost inflation or under declaration, it becomes a historical matter. Records are not clear. There's room for a lot of dispute. You really never can use retrospective management to get money back. And the reason why that is so critical, that point about retrospective management, is that there's actually a good way to fix it. The way to fix it is to have proactive management. Every month, the big multinational producers of oil in Guyana, like ExxonMobil, CNOOC, and the rest, and both those that are operators, like ExxonMobil, and those that are just co-venturers, like Hess, they send reports to the ministry as well as to the regulator. Now, that data is shared with key government agencies, particularly the Revenue Authority. The most important thing you can build is a proactive, predictive variance detector, so that when that data comes in and they put it in the models, they begin to see if there's a reason for them to do a proactive audit. Without that kind of mechanism, you wait for 2 years, then 3 years, then you audit them for 10 years back. It's not an efficient way of preventing base erosion, cost inflation, all of these things that I've talked about. So that's a very important point. The other thing is to have risk-based controls that are intelligent to the way that business is done in the industry. And here I'll give an example of Ghana. So in Ghana, we have multiple fields and we have multiple blocks. The blocks don't always correspond to the field. Basically, what we license to the investor is not always where all the oil is found. Sometimes there are multiple blocks and some of the oil cross boundaries, etc. That can lead to a situation where, for the big companies, they can have fiscal consolidation and shift costs across the different projects. So when they shift costs across the different projects, it leads to a situation where profit for a particular producing field is lower than it should be. And so we introduced this term called ring fencing to try and prevent that. Unfortunately, the law itself was outmoded, and the law required ring fencing to be done at block level rather than field level. So we had to update that. But that's learning on our feet very rapidly. By that time, a lot of money had already gone under the bridge. So how does Guyana get smart? By understanding these kinds of things, by having this ability to have an international advisory network of people all over the world who've seen this before, who've done this before, that can help them to build a proactive system. That's very critical. You can't do it all of certain in Guyana, no matter all the expertise you have, because some of this stuff is experiential. You have to have experienced it to understand it. You look at the US system, and the way the US system is designed, because a lot of the US system is based on corporate tax. They don't like all this royalty stuff and that. So corporate tax is the big thing. How you make your profit, we take money out of it. But that also means that we have to really, really audit your costs very effectively. Auditing your costs very effectively means we need to understand your technological setup, how you actually operate. And so you see that in the US system, it goes all the way down when it comes to the guides that they provide to tax inspectors. It goes all the way down to making specific determinations around production technologies and its implication on tax. Can Guyana get to that level? Why not? That knowledge is out there. It's just a matter of determination. And that all these kind of best practice controls are not magic. Other countries have done it. There are people close to it who have fought battles. You can build, think of it like an artificial intelligence, large language model, where you bring in all of these pieces all over around the world to make sure that you generate outputs that are intelligent, proactive, and predictive. Now, I will touch on in the last few minutes that I've got on some key things that are not there in Guyana right now, or are there in a very inchoate form, and which you therefore need to improve. So I call that the situational gap analysis. One obvious point is to make a determination whether you want to continue to receive your share of the returns in oil or in money. It may look simple. I mean, do we take it in oil or do we take it in money? But actually, it turns out that there are a lot of interesting things that can come out depending on the choice you make. One of the things that can come out if you decide to use oil to get your share in oil, actually as opposed to the money, is that you can collateralize it for additional money. And there are ways in which that can be beneficial, but also very risky. So we've seen that happen in countries like Nigeria, because they take their returns, they take it in oil, or their share of output is taken in oil. We've seen some of it happening in Chad in ways that are not always very pleasant, but the case studies are there. Remember, though, that you are dealing in a situation of high volumes. You are projecting about 1 million barrels a day very soon. That's because you have high producing fields. At that large volumes scale, or that scale of large volumes, distributional effects are very complex, etc. But you don't have a particular problem. It's a problem that you will begin to have very soon when these oil fields are not as prolific, and which we are learning in Africa is very critical. In fact, it's so critical that it's one of the entry points to have Guyanese businesses become involved in actual production. So you're not entirely dependent on foreign companies. And that is this whole thing we call marginality. You have some shallow fields, shallow blocks, or blocks in shallow water. Now, blocks in shallow water literally just means that it's cheaper to produce and you need less advanced technology. Kawawan is a very good discovery, or semi-discovery, because they're not going to, they shut it down. But all that part of the acreage where you have shallow water, where you've made a discovery already, even if it's not a commercial discovery, all of that field is available now to start to think in terms of how do we get marginal producers involved. Companies in Guyana who don't have advanced technology, don't have a lot of money now, can begin to be prepared to start to play in shallow water. Nigeria waited too long before they started doing this. And by the time that they were dealing with marginality, time was already not on their side. You can start now. The other thing you can also begin to think about is that when you think of marginality and concepts like that, is to distinguish between project economics and social economics. Project economics is just to look at the numbers in the context of the project alone. That almost always leads you to not getting involved as a country. Your people think it's too risky, we can't find the money. When you look at it in terms of social economics as a whole, what are the tax concessions that are available? What are the technology transfer agreements that can be done, etc.? There's much more creativity for what can happen in terms of your people getting involved. The other thing you don't have is you don't have the mechanism that links the output, the money that you make as a country, the fiscal take, to dynamics in the market. So, for instance, when oil prices change dramatically, it doesn't really change your fiscal situation in Guyana. You want to think about that very strongly. You also want to think about a national oil company. You've been talking about that for a long time now. I'm not too clear what that debate is at, what at our present point that debate is at. But the key thing to recognize is that almost all the big oil producing companies, the global south, do have national oil companies. National oil companies tend to reflect resource overdependence, which what that means is that the stronger the national oil company, typically also the more dependent that economy is on the natural resource or the oil. And so you have to bear that in mind as you structure it. There are also national oil companies that become a problem. They become an albatross around your neck. They incur debt, and that debt becomes the national debt. So there are huge fiscal implications for having a national oil company. My advice, and this is the only big idea I'll leave you with in this presentation. My advice is that have a national oil company, but that national oil company should not focus on upstream production. It should focus on linkages across the oil services chain. So it should be more focused on the services that are going to the oil fields and that are leading to production, marketing, and the rest than it is in actual upstream production in the beginning. And it should be embedded in such a way that it can help with cost control. Because what happens is that it provides competition, which is sovereign competition for some of the service delivery. That makes it very difficult for these big companies to lie about how much is being produced. That will also be how you create the linkage to your sovereign wealth fund, which is going to be a big deal as you continue to design that. And you have to be aware of all the case studies that we know from Papua New Guinea and others about how not to do this, etc., which I don't have the time to go into. And already Dr. Ram has talked about this whole thing about green and climate. You have to remember that it's really critical that you remember that it is indeed a fact that the green transition will create pressure, and therefore decarbonization in the fields is going to be a thing. The question is it going to be done by the same companies that are benefiting from your oil, or is all the decarbonization going to be done by creative companies in Guyana that can do that decarbonization and the hydrogen production and all of these ancillary activities? And how do you link that to your national wealth strategy and your sovereign wealth strategy? And how do you link that to everything else? Too much to talk about, too little time, but I hope I've given you a flavor.
I know you've given us a really wonderful flavor. And first off, let me say thank you, because I think that it's precisely, what you've just given us is the sort of way in which we're hoping that we can, we have a sort of thinking that ideas matter, and they really do matter profoundly in our context. And quite frequently we're simply not being as imaginative enough as we ought to be. And maybe I'll take this moment to bring Professor Brian in to kind of, I know we've gone way beyond the time. The board has been filled with questions. We will have to do this again. That's clear to me that we will have to do this again. Let me thank you, and let me ask Professor Brian to come in and give us a sense of what he's heard today. And we'll try to maybe just have one question where everyone can kind of offer a closing remark, because we've gone, I think, about 30 minutes over, but perfectly fine. I think this was well worth us going 30 minutes over, because I don't think we've had this kind of discussion in our press, or we've had this kind of discussion in our political environment. And I think it's important for them to begin to see this kind of guidance. Professor Brian? Yeah,
well, it would be not appropriate for me to try to summarize anything at all. This has been, a very active discussion, very rich discussion. And certainly Mr. Simmons put a good cap on it, by bringing the global perspective. I think what I heard mostly was the question of creating strong institutions, industrial policy that works. Justin Ram brought that out very clearly. Mr. Simmons, I think you indicated that the diversity, boom and bust. This has been the traditional picture. I come from Trinidad and Tobago, and I know the subject very well, the question of boom and bust. And I think that the strongest takeaways here have really been the fiscal, how you get your fiscal house in order, and that presentation by Mr. Constantine and by Mr. Braffett, they really dealt with that subject in some detail. I don't want to continue any further with this. I think I would endorse what Terence just said. We have to have another one, maybe another one.
I think we must look. There's a full board of questions, which I obviously it's almost impossible to get to all of the questions that are here. But I think it's important to set the stage. Usually, as I wrote in the thing, sort of just setting the stage one, setting the stage two, because I think we haven't quite set the stage. And I have to say, one comment which I want to share is that this has been such a proud-making display of global talent. Right? It's been that sort of resonance on the side of folks who have been listening. And so what I want to do is maybe take this up. So we're going to do another round of this. That's clear. Justin's presentation, Bright's presentation, Colin's presentation, they've all raised issues that require a proper delving into. What I'll probably do is write a few things following this, but maybe in the last 6 minutes or so, we'll just go for 6 minutes. I'll give each of you kind of 2 minutes to just offer a closing remark. And one of the things I suggested is if you could offer something for folks to read on anything that you've said here thus far. So maybe I'll start with Samuel, you first, then Thomas, then Justin, then I'll come to Colin, and then to Bright. I'm going in the opposite order. So Samuel, you get the first 2 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Terence, and congratulations to the other panelists for their respective contributions. In closing, I want to touch on something that Justin had to say, and that is the importance of education. It is something that is close to my heart too. And I want to say this within the context that when we talk about economic growth and GDP and so on, what we have to recognize is that ultimately, as I say to students every time, economics is about people. So if you're unable to show how all of these lofty growth rates are translating to an improvement in people's lives, then you're not doing right by them. Yes. So I do agree. Education and health are critical areas. Now, I made a recommendation, not a recommendation so much, but more an endorsement of what I view as an industrial policy initiative by the government of Guyana to promote agriculture. And I find this to be crucial in the sense that when you look at what is harming our region in terms of deaths, non-communicable diseases are a critical problem. And why so? We are importing increasing amounts of over-processed foods to the neglect of our indigenous foods. And there's no clearer example of this than Shamar Joseph, the cricketer the entire region has been celebrating over the last couple of weeks. He came from a community in Barakara, and I doubt he would have been exposed to all of the over-processed foods we consume on the coast. Yes? And he was able to perform exceptionally well at the Gabba. One of the things we don't recognize, or we don't say much about the Gabba, between 1988 and 2024, 3 teams, or I should say 3 times the Australians have lost to the Gabba. The West Indies, 2024, India in 2021, and the West Indies in 1988. So it's a big deal to win at the Gabba. Yes? And here we have a young man not exposed to all the over-processed foods that we consume, and he was able to do well, to perform well. So I agree wholeheartedly with a plan for agriculture to avoid the Dutch disease. And just to be clear, I still see some confusion in the group. Dutch disease is one expression of the resource curse. I rest my case at that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin, we'll come back to, I posted it because the audience is suggesting that we have to do a second webinar where it's just about the questions that the folks wanted to ask all of you here. So take your 2 minutes and give us a closeout from your end on the discussion.
I'm sorry, Terence. I think I'm sleeping. Was that for me?
Yes.
I apologize. Yeah.
8 at your time now.
No, that's all right. Well, congratulations, everyone. Thought-provoking presentations. I guess all I want to say is that, we're excited with oil wealth because it now allows us to not money finance our deficits. We're supposed to be oil financing our deficits. That's what this excitement is all about, right? Barbados recently, a few years ago, had an IMF standby agreement because it's monetizing its deficits. Jamaica, massive buildup in debt, loss of foreign exchange reserves, extremely high rates of inflation because it's monetizing its deficits. Oil-rich Guyana, oil-rich Ghana, and other cases, they're monetizing the deficits. Rather than leaving a final comment, I want to leave a question for Guyanese. Why in oil-rich Guyana we're monetizing our deficits? Happy to get into more detail on another webinar. Thanks.
Well, Thomas, on that note, why in oil-rich Guyana are we monetizing our deficits, and is this a sustainable strategy kind of moving forward? And your last thoughts for today's webinar. You're muted, Thomas.
Right. So I think this is really a useful question to ask, because it leads me to ask a prior question. Why do we even have deficits, given that we're oil rich? Why do we even have fiscal deficits to finance? As I said in my presentation, we've got fiscal stimuli happening on top of major growth originating in our oil and gas sector. What we see, as I close off here, what we see in Guyana is that we're clearly making mistakes that countries around the world have made. It's a great temptation, and it's very easy to make these mistakes, because decisions are being made principally by the government, by the state, by the fiscal authority, if those decisions aren't being made by the actors in the oil and gas sector. Of course, there are other sectors too that are making decisions. But when the state, when the fiscal authority has so much space that it can make decisions for which there might be serious opportunity costs, the decisions might be large-scale decisions, or they might go down to the terms of a contract, as Bright talked about. When it becomes a matter of the state making decisions, we have to be really cognizant, we have to be really careful that we have a particular kind of fiscal entity that learns on its own, that itself seeks to enhance its ability to do better. And I think that as we in Guyana, we hear stories of how transformative this country is. We naturally ask ourselves, will it be a case of our coming full circle after 20 years to find out that, well, as other countries have done, that it hasn't added up to very much. Justin and Sammy talked about some of the ingredients for getting this right, as well as Bright. The question, and it's not as if we're not aware of these things. We are, maybe not in such great detail. But how do we get the state, the fiscal entity, the political entity to respond to these things that we're talking about? Let's take one in particular that I thought was a victory of ours. Our stability clause in the PSA, it seemed to preclude any action on our part. But when there was excessive gas flaring in the Stabroek block, well, I in particular discovered that in the PSA itself, there was a loophole that allowed Guyana to implement what essentially was a carbon tax on the carbon content of flaring. Now, are we able to exploit loopholes like those, or to ensure that we design contracts and institutions so that we get the best out of oil? I think it comes back to that question, and it does come back to maybe the large framework of getting governance right, but also that other element of ensuring that we learn, and we have the capacity to learn, and we have the incentives right. I conclude by saying this final thing. In the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act provided some very important incentives that today are driving the US economy in remarkable ways. I looked at our budget and I kept on asking, what are the incentives there and what are they adding up to? I want to congratulate obviously my colleagues here, and in particular you, Terence, because maybe it's mechanisms such as these that could get us to learn, to incorporate the lessons that are available to us. So with that, I'd like to say that it really does depend on our ability to embrace what lessons are there and to be held accountable when we don't.
Justin, can we, from your perch, find the courage to embrace the lessons, to learn the lessons that are there, and have the courage to actually aim to implement them? What is, from your perch, how have we done that in the Caribbean, and is that possible? Or perhaps a better question is, how do we do it? I have a colleague who will say, we have to know what to change to, and how to cause that change. So how do we cause that change?
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Terence, and just congratulations to all the other panelists. From my point of view, in my summary, I think we really have to focus on the capitals within our economy. And when I say capitals, I'm speaking about the natural capital, the man-made capital, the human capital, and of course the financial capital. And to understand that when we exploit the oil and gas resources or any type of natural capital, we are depleting those capitals. But for economic growth to be sustainable, you must maintain and grow your capital base over time. And so it's very important that as you exploit and deplete one type of capital, that you are investing significantly in other forms of capital. And I think here we know that Guyana needs significant investment in man-made capital and, of course, in human capital, coming back to what Samuel said before. So my focus here before I leave is to say that I think we need to focus on how we drive sustainable development through the efficient use of the revenues coming from the depletion of the oil and gas resources, so that we maintain and indeed grow the capital base of the country, so that you can see sustainable development over time, not only for the next decade or the decade after that, but for centuries after. How you invest now is going to be critical. And I just want to say this last point, that when it comes to human capital, the way how it is measured is that we invest in education, we invest in health, but you can only turn those investments into tangible rewards for individuals if they have a good economy to go into and turn those into tangible rewards. Yes, if you think about it, they have the ability to become entrepreneurs or to become strong laborers in that labor market, working for strong firms, for example. So again, that facilitation is going to be very, very important. And as you had asked at the beginning, for your audience members, I would recommend the book, The Mechanism of the Open Petroleum Economy. It's an old book now by Dudley Sayers. I think it's worth reading for anyone who is interested in how you avoid the so-called Dutch disease or the resource curse. And indeed, it cannot be said that a country so full of wealth should really fall to the resource curse. It is easy for us to avoid it if we manage the revenues and seek to invest and save for the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. And Bright, among the panelists, since you nominally speaking are our guests, we are from the region, and you are someone who is outside of the region, but also in some way, our region comes from you. So we give you the honor of the last word, and I should say that your presentation is quite well received. Harry Vogelson notes that Mr. Simmons is one of the most informed and instructive contributions to the discussion on resource-rich countries, and this is the quality of the discussion that we should be having. And so I give you the last word.
Thank you very much. Mr. Linjay is obviously very kind. I've been extremely well educated by all the very perceptive insights that have been shared during this webinar. I think Guyana is actually very blessed that you still have the opportunity to, almost in a leisurely manner, to think big and to examine these matters from that kind of perspective. I wanted to wrap up by reminding all of us about a very interesting story from history. And that is that the first country to ever produce oil in South America was in Peru. And between 1963 and 1924, they were the only producers in South America, the only producer of oil. Eventually, they became part of a multinational ring of investment, primarily dominated by the United States, and with linkages from the United States to the rest of the region. So there were, for instance, oil refineries nearby, and these oil refineries in Chile and the rest will take oil from Argentina, they'll take oil from Peru and the like. Eventually, Peru ran out of oil. But the reason why that is an interesting story is that today, very few people associate Peru with oil. And that is the funny thing with oil. It's a very ethereal substance that sometimes leaves no trace. It can enter your economy, and all the trace that it leaves is this pernicious, fumes that enter other sectors, and then it disappears. Until 1971, Norway had no oil at all. But they had already built a significant amount of capacity without oil. And therefore, it was easy for Norway to sterilize oil, to create a bubble and put oil in it such that oil does not contaminate the soul of Norway. And I think that effort is now underway in Guyana. How will Guyanese embrace that effort of creating a set of conditions and holding containers in which oil, because of its attitude of being very shifty, moving in and moving out, can come in and leave without anybody missing oil? If Guyana builds the institutions, builds the structures, such that oils passing through Guyana will be almost uneventful, then it will have succeeded. And I think that is so, so, so critical. There are not many commodities in the world that are cross-cutting like oil. It's the only one from a Gringer causality point of view that is correlated with almost every other non-renewable source of non-renewable resource. Oil is the only one. So it's a special substance in a way, but in a way it's also a very pernicious substance. And I think because Guyana is such a special country, my prayer is that you will build the infrastructure and the structures that will make oil an uneventful pass-through.
Well, thank you. I guess I have to give the last word to Professor Brian here, because I think what you've just raised for us requires a bit more experience and a bit more wisdom in the closing. So, Professor Brian, you get the absolute last word to thank you.
I don't think this is the last word. I mean, we have a lot more to do.
Word for today.
Last word for today. Well, look, the bottom line is that with all of this information that we have, Guyana can learn from the mistakes or the successes from provinces that went before. Okay, there's a lot to learn. Secondly, I think that we focus a lot on our regional circumstance, which is to say Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and so on. So I think the perspective that Mr. Simmons brought, Dr. Constantine brought, these are essential additives to the discussion. If I may, Terence, there are two books that I would recommend, obviously. The first of them is a very classic, The Quest by Daniel Gergen. That has become something to be looked at or criticized. And there is a modern one that just came out 2 years ago by Rachel Maddow, of all the people, the lady who does the work at NBC, called The Quest. Sorry, called Blowout. It is the deepest look at the vagrancies that go on within the industry that one might wish to read. So The Quest and The Blowout, those would be the two considered. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your input. This has really been great. Thank you on behalf of the CPC and the GBJ.
Thank you, colleagues. Have a wonderful, and I'll be in touch via email. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.